Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing. We start with the latest in Afghanistan. The Taliban entered the capital Kabul on Sunday. A tense panic has gripped the city, sending hundreds of Afghans trying to flee the country, although all commercial flights are cancelled. The Taliban takeover drew worries and reactions worldwide. For its part, China made an appeal to fully respect Afghan's sovereignty and people's will, expecting the Taliban to keep its words on a peaceful transition.
The situation in Afghanistan has undergone major changes. China respects the will and the choices of the Afghan people. China noted that yesterday, the Taliban said the war in Afghanistan is over and that they will negotiate to form an open and inclusive Islamic government and take responsible actions to ensure the safety of Afghan citizens and foreign missions in the country. China expects the Taliban to follow through on these statements to ensure a smooth transition of the situation in Afghanistan.
That's a spokesperson from the Chinese Foreign Ministry. The U.S. President Joe Biden insists the initial move of forces departure. Now the troops are deploying to evacuate the diplomatic personnel and citizens. The British Defense Minister says they will not send the forces back to fight. Russian ambassador to Afghanistan will also meet the Taliban delegate on Tuesday. The UN Security Council has scheduled an emergency meeting on Monday. Now let's take a look back at the group's rapid advance over the past few weeks.
The American troops began their withdrawal from their Afghan military base on July 2nd. The move signaled the end of the 20-year U.S. involvement in the war. Meanwhile, the Taliban said they could present a written peace proposal to the Afghan government as soon as August. Within the 3 weeks, the U.S. military said the Taliban fighters had gained control of about half of the country's districts.
Their forces will continue to flow over
Though the Pentagon vowed to continue support to Afghan troops in the coming weeks to counter Taliban attacks, the Islamist group expanded its reach in August. On August 6th, the Taliban seized southern Zalaj, the first provincial capital. More followed in the ensuing days, including the prize of Kunduz in the north. On August 13th, they took 4 more key provincial capitals in a single day. On August 14th, Afghanistan's 4th largest city, Majili-Sharif, fell to the Taliban, as well as Pul Alam, the provincial capital just 40 miles south of Kabul. On August 15th, the Taliban took the key eastern city of Jalalabad, neighboring Kabul, without a fight. And massive evacuation took place in Kabul. President Ashraf Ghani and foreign diplomats were among those fleeing. The new chapter for the Taliban began as one of its most senior officials declared in Kabul their swift victory over the Afghan government.
And now let's get up close to the ground in Kabul. Meanwhile, we are joined in the studio by Mr. Li Guofu, who is the director of the Center for Middle East Studies with China Institute of International Studies. Mr. Li, good to see you. There are a lot of new development going on as we speak. We understand, according to the U.S. side, news reports that the Taliban has claimed that it has got full control of the capital. What would that mean?
I think, which means that, the Taliban has already entered into the presidential palace. And also they have talked as latest news with the Afghanistan government internal minister. And the internal minister said, there was ready to hand the power to the
At this
Taliban.
moment, we didn't see any time schedule yet, though.
Yes, but they have already an exercise sort of a curfew at the night in order to prevent any looting and robbery, and in order to keep the social order of Kabul.
And now the Taliban has also disciplined its followers, suggesting they are not going to threaten the former Afghan officials or taking away their vehicles, otherwise they will be severely pursued. Obviously, they try to make the discipline clear to the public to claim that they are what they claim to be.
Yes, of course. You see that, they said, they have to make sure to the Afghan people, they are responsible government in order to let Afghan people to have a peaceful and stability kind of life.
Even though the Kabul and most part of Afghanistan are in the hands of the Taliban, there are also those that are trying to so-called fight back. For example, the former vice president of Afghanistan. How much do you see these kinds of quote-unquote fighting back is going to make an impact?
I think that this is a kind of a warning to Taliban and warn them that the Taliban has to share the powers with some other non-Talibans or some other functions, and otherwise there would be sort of internal fighting. Because if you look at the Afghanistan, those different the powers may got the support from different regional countries, so the possibility is always there.
Very interesting. We are, as we earlier indicated, that the Russian people are going to see the Taliban delegate, the Russian embassy in Afghanistan, and also we see the Iranian embassy are reducing the number of people in the embassy in Kabul. We see different kinds of development all at the same time.
Yes, that's is very normal. All these embassies, all the foreign missions would take a number of proportion measures in order to reduce the risk maybe happen to their staffs or their people in Afghanistan.
The Chinese embassy, of course, have been giving warnings to the Chinese citizens in Afghanistan for their safety. However, I've been hearing that there will be some kinds of evacuation of the Chinese citizens from Afghanistan, though the schedule is also not clear at this moment.
I think so far we have heard the embassy will stay behind and they will open and also return to a normal the kind of functions. But most of Chinese citizens, especially these engineering or these the Chinese experts are helping the Afghanistan in various projects have already left Afghanistan, and those, especially a few, those would be regarded as the most necessary people. They will stay behind.
I see. There are a lot of things also going on from the U.S. side. We understand from the National Security Advisor that the U.S. president is likely to speak to the American public at any moment, even though there's no time schedule about when. A lot of questions, I'm sure, the U.S. president has to answer from the press if he is really meeting the press.
Yeah, I think the most we have already heard that the former president Donald Trump has already said that he has should be resigned in a disgrace. Because he's a brain, he's a brain, and he have maybe take all the responsibilities for this kind of designs. And also, some the U.S. Republican senators has even said that there are a lot of blood in the hands of John Biden. So there's a kind of internal fightings between the Republicans and also Democrats.
But you see very clearly from this administration, various officials, whether it's National Security Advisor or the Secretary of State or the Defense Secretary, have all been saying it's the Afghan leadership, it's the Afghan police, Afghan army that is lacking there on the ground. And the U.S. was only building a house on the sand, using their exact quote. So there's a blaming game already going on.
Yes, the U.S. Secretary of Defense has already said you could not help a country if the lack of leadership. You could not, buy the will or the resolve and also the leadership. The country like Afghanistan, no matter how long the U.S. stay, but could not finish its, the the objectives.
Right. Thank you so much, Mr. Li Guofu, with us. And also joining us, we have an Afghan journalist, Parviz Karakal, coming to us live from the Afghan capital, Kabul. Mr. Karakal, thank you so much for joining us. I know there are a lot of things going on all at the same time. First of all, the Kabul airport, what's going on there? It seems that the U.S. Embassy people have all left Kabul.
Thank you. Actually, as you mentioned, that the large number of Afghan civilians and passengers, they are still stuck in the Kabul airport, and they are banned and not allowed by the U.S. forces to travel. Taliban have no control on the Kabul airports, so thus the large number of Afghan civilian and passengers since this morning waiting travel along with foreigners, but they are not allowed by the U.S. forces inside the Kabul International Airport.
But I would assume as a result of that, there will be a lot of frustrations on the ground, right?
Yes, like this morning, it's said to be that the U.S. forces open firing on the passengers.
Gunshots.
And inflicted a few casualties to the Afghan civilians. So
has that been confirmed yet? Has that been confirmed yet? That there were already civilian casualties, not those dropping off from the plane, but by gunshots? Or is it confirmed that it's from the U.S. forces? Or we do not know at this moment?
Yes, they were shot by gun, and because inside the airport only U.S. forces to be seen.
I see. What about the other areas of Kabul? The Taliban claim they have pretty much in control of the capital city. What do you know now?
Like this, almost 1 hour back, I went to the city and walked with my friend, and I saw Taliban was standing, walking freely around the Kabul city, like Sharina, Wazir Akbar Khan, and they have control in all city of Kabul. And they made some checkpoints as well, and they were checking some vehicles as well. So they have full control on the Kabul city right now.
We have already seen from some of the live news footages that women are beginning to wear scarves and very long scarves as they used to years ago. Is that what you are seeing? Do you see people are becoming ever more cautious about these cultural customs and also traditions, at least in the eyes of the Taliban?
So far, we didn't see that the Taliban forcefully they obligated the women to wear scarves. Today I saw some women and girls they wear some hijab as well, and so far we didn't see that the Taliban obligated women to wear scarves. I didn't see so far that the Taliban obligated to women to do that.
All right, I see. Thank you so much for joining us. Parviz Karakal coming to us from the Afghan capital, Kabul. Be safe there, Parviz. Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Li Guofu, for joining us. Really appreciate it. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Coming up in the program, we'll delve deeper into the rapidly evolving situation in Afghanistan after this break. Welcome back. This is World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The Taliban is preparing to open talks for a new inclusive government. Uncertainties remain over the new Taliban leadership, which direction the country will be taken to in Afghanistan. So what exactly is the Taliban in Afghanistan today? Are their commitments delaying tactics, or will they lead to tangible changes? I talked to guests from all over the world. Let's listen. And I'm joined by Junaid Ahmed, the director of the Center for Global Dialogue and professor of the Middle Eastern Politics from the University of Lahore, Pakistan. Mr. Ahmed, good to see you. I know you are now based in the United States. Tell me more about what is your assessment of Taliban today, especially Taliban in Afghanistan?
This Taliban movement, in some ways, has radically transformed. I think what the British military intelligence have termed it is very appropriate. They call it the neo-Taliban. And what that indicates is a dramatic a willingness by the Taliban to do things that in the past one would not expect them.
Right.
That is to be inclusive of other ethnic groups, to politically negotiate it, to what they have done throughout, which is grant general amnesty to their enemies and people who have been working. So it is all of these little steps along the way of this kind of rapid takeover that gives one a sense that this is actually a new Taliban movement that is far more willing to politically negotiate what in the past were probably considered as enemies.
Tell me more about the current leader of Taliban, Mullah Baradar. He has been, by analysts, many around the world, identified as the possible leader of the new country, if that is what the process is going to be like. So tell me more about this person. He was captured, he was released, he working with Omar. So a lot of mixed messages.
Right. Well, I mean, we have to understand that he is both the political and spiritual leader at the moment of the Taliban. So any actions that it has undertaken, of course, well before the American withdrawal began, certainly came with his approval. But of course, that also includes what I've just said, the willingness of the Taliban to negotiate, to not engage in violence against those who are more than willing to kind of surrender and work with the new Taliban. So I think we have to understand that these orders come straight from the top. The political spokesperson of the Taliban, Mohammed Naeem, made it very clear that the Taliban will continue to try to have good relations, not only with its neighbors, but with all countries. And I think that their delegation to Russia, to Iran, to China is an indication of what they're going to do. In terms of domestically, he said that respecting minority rights, respecting women's rights.
But we know that Taliban, given how it was being run over the past 20 years, sometimes are kind of running sporadically. So how much power does this person really have?
Yeah, I know. I think that, of course, being such a broad-based movement, which we, of course, now are discovering. I mean, I think the fundamental mistake that we made is to have seen this as kind of a fringe group, heavily militarized. In fact, it's the opposite. It in fact was a much larger movement than many Western analysts thought. And of course, the principal way, as we've seen, has not been through military victory now, but in some type of political victory from one capital to the next. So I think that it does demonstrate that there's a significant degree of discipline within the movement itself. And we saw it right now, as I said, in Kabul, when they could have clearly taken the city by force, but the leadership told them not to, and that to politically negotiate this transitional period in Afghanistan.
Now, the very, shall I say, challenging scene is in the airport of Afghanistan's capital, Kabul. According to some of the latest photos we've seen, there seems to be a lot of chaos. The U.S. was shooting, doing gunshots in the air just to make sure there was certain kinds of order, according to media reports once again. But tell me, sir, how do you see Taliban might be reacting to different kinds of messages, even though it promised earlier about certain bottom lines?
This is key to gaining the respect of the international community at this particular point, and that is to guaranteeing the safe evacuation of foreigners in the diplomatic corps and others working in NGOs and so on. So I think that we did, of course, see gunshots and some firing at the airport. But I do think that if they are sensible, and I think they will be, they will allow this process. Of course, this is just the first day of it. So I think that they will allow these foreigners to go, because I think this will be this initial step that they can demonstrate to the international community that, look, we are allowing a peaceful withdrawal and so on.
We are looking at going to Qatar, both Mr. Karzai and some of the others, together with leaders of the Taliban and as well as from the earlier Afghan government, going to have a peaceful transition, according to the latest words they use. How do you see the role of Taliban will be played then? What do you think is the best gesture they should have and could have then?
Well, I think the best move by the Taliban at this point is again to satisfy, to assuage the fears that the international community has about what type of regime this will be. Will it be a very draconian, totalitarian regime that also plays a role in destabilizing its neighbors and so on? Or can it be a force for stabilization, for a transition to an inclusive type of government and so on? So I think that right now the Taliban is very, I think, politically savvy about these things. And I think that we probably will see them being much more willing, as they have said now, to negotiate a political resolution. I mean, as they have said now, the war is over.
My final question briefly from you. We heard from the media report about what Mr. Mullah Baradar said after the Afghan forces went into the presidential palace in Kabul. He said it was unexpected success and there's future tests. How would you interpret that?
I think probably even the Taliban itself was surprised at how quickly it has been able to take over most of the country and enter Kabul. So I think that, you know, they're trying to adapt to what they have taken over and the political situation now, just as we are in terms of analyzing it. So I think that this is essentially what he means, that we have to kind of see how we will do on the job, you know?
Let time tell, right?
Yeah.
Junaid
Absolutely.
Ahmed, Director of the Center for Global Dialogue, Professor from the University of Lahore in Pakistan. Thank you so much, sir, for providing your perspective. On the latest with Afghanistan, in Istanbul, we have Dr. Harun Rahimi, Assistant Professor of Law from American University of Afghanistan. He is right now on his way to Afghanistan. In Washington, D.C., Ahmad Shah Mohibi, founder and president of the Rise to Peace. That's an organization about the peace in Afghanistan. He's originally from Afghanistan. In Washington, D.C., Michael O'Hanlon, Senior Fellow and Director of Research for Foreign Policy from the Brookings Institution, also author of the book, The Art of War in an Age of Peace, U.S. Grand Strategy and Resolute Restraint. Last but not least, in Beijing, Yang Xiyu, Senior Research Fellow from the China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. How should we understand the speed of change? Mr. Rahimi.
I think it means that the system was much more rotten and hollow than I expected. I think it means that the Taliban might have not been honest about their intention to actually make peace in Afghanistan and agree with their oppositions, with the anti-Taliban elements on a sort of shared government or some sort of compromise. It seems like it's been military strategy all along, and the peace process was just a tactic for delay. In my assessment, it means that the anti-Taliban camp was very demoralized by the speed of U.S. withdrawal and as well by the infighting in the political class, among the political class in Kabul.
Mr. Mohibi, for you.
what strikes me the most is that most units and most provinces fall into Taliban without any resistance. And I think Atta Mohammed Noor, the former governor of Balkh, and General Dostum, they call it a conspiracy of them being captured. Look in Herat, Ismail Khan was invited to participate in a meeting in the 209 Corps, 207 Corps, and then he was arrested right there. To me, it was more a combination of both the United States lack of, I would say, intelligence capabilities, and at the same time, failed diplomatic ways of how you handle the Afghan peace talks. Look, you're dealing with an insurgency, the Taliban. You have to combat and you have to have pressure on the ground, at the same time negotiate with them. I think it was just something that just was giving to them, the Taliban, the whole peace process, everything. So I think a lot of it is a combination of both in Afghanistan, president, his weak leadership also, and a lot of combination, a lot of stuff that led to the speedy Taliban takeover.
Already a laundry list of reasons, it seems, that interpreted by both of you. Mr. O'Hanlon, your interpretation of the speed, what does it say?
I think most of all, it's the psychology that is a snowballing effect, where you have questions about why the United States and NATO decided to make this abrupt decision back in April. And then you had questions about why their primary focus is on getting their own forces out safely and not on handing off a good strategy to the Afghan security forces. And then you saw a few provincial capitals fall without much resistance. And if you were an Afghan soldier and you saw all this happening, why would you give your life in defense of a cause that seems to be faltering and failing? So I believe the entire psychology became mutually reinforcing. And we know that Afghans, by the way, I admire Afghans not wanting to fight for a pointless cause. We saw this 20 years ago when the Taliban were defeated, and many of their fighters just gave up. And we see it these last few weeks. And maybe there is even a tiny glimmer of hopefulness that Afghans are tired of fighting. Now, I'm not going to make too much of this. I am very unhappy about what's happened this week. I'm very sad, and I'm very skeptical of the Taliban.
Mr. Yang, to you, what does it say? What happened? How should we digest?
Well, such a speedy changes really indicate two big lessons. Number one, the remaking of the Afghanistan set by the United States 20 years ago has been failed. Many American politicians conclude that the reason for the collapse of the Afghanistan regime as a high-level corruption and a low-level morality. But the question is, during the past 20 years, this regime was made by the United States. It should be high level of morality and a low level corruption. But the reality is the opposite. So that means the regime planted by outsiders has failed. So that is the basic reason why almost without resistance falling the Taliban hand. And number two, such a speedy changes means uncertainty on everything in Afghanistan begins. What kind of governance the new regime, Taliban, will set? What kind of relation between the political forces internal will be? And what kind of fate for all Afghanistan people will be? No one can answer a lot of uncertain questions.
Now, Mr. O'Hanlon, at the airport, how do you see situation will evolve there? What's going to be U.S. guarantee that things will be in order and no one will be hurt during this process? Well, Taliban already promised it will not go into that area because that was according to the earlier agreement.
Right. The U.S. commitment to make sure no one is hurt does not count for very much at this point. The Taliban commitment is the interesting question. I believe the United States will do whatever it can to get its own people out safely and those close to us, those who have worked with us. Beyond that, President Biden's already been pretty clear. He does not feel a commitment to this ongoing struggle. I regret that decision, but that is the decision. It's a very clear decision, and he has not changed his mind this week. So we're going to learn a lot about the Taliban in the next few days. How do they want to be understood and potentially integrated into the international community?
But we do know that there were gunshots that people heard at the airport.
Okay.
And inside, there's no Taliban at this
point. My friend,
The
question is, will there be a major effort to impede the relocation of friendly people? Will there be a major effort to exact retribution and vengeance against those who have been trying to build a new Afghanistan? The Taliban has to make big choices and honor those. And we cannot worry about 1 or 2 gunshots. We have to worry about the overall trend.
More than 2,000 U.S. military people died in this war, 20 years, and $1 trillion US dollars, 20 years of saga. How should we interpret that? I hate to ask that question, but this question has to be asked.
Yeah, it's not a success for the United States and for our NATO allies. We have not been successful in our broader aspirations. We wanted to make an Afghanistan that was stable enough that there could not be future extremism come out of Afghanistan. Overall, I would say we did not do nearly as well as we wanted, nearly as well as I thought we would, and I will accept personal responsibility for having been more optimistic about what we could accomplish than we have been able to achieve. But it does not mean that everything was a failure, and also it does not mean we know what the future will hold. There is still promise and hope for the future.
Mr. Rahimi, if I could just ask you to comment about the U.S. role, because I think that's an important question.
You have to realize that Afghan society was transformed through U.S. intervention. A lot of it, in my opinion, was for the better. There were a lot of opportunities for young Afghans to find their voice. There has been a strong civil society. There are success stories to be told. In terms of the failure that we saw, I don't attribute that to Afghan society rejecting the vision flourishing over the past 20 years of the U.S. presence in Afghanistan. But in terms of the reality on the ground of how things fell, I absolutely agree that there's a lot of blame to be to pass along. A lot of people played a role, and they should be held accountable. The leadership of Afghan government, and it doesn't stop with the president. Many people who inside and outside government engaged in corruption, predatory behavior toward the population must be held accountable. United States, corruption was not only an Afghan government problem, it was a problem in Afghanistan all around. But I would like to just to point this out, that there's a success story to be told as well in terms of how Afghan society was transformed. Now the question is, I mean, now that 30+ million people are defenseless against the Taliban, because the military failed, because the institutions that were supposed to preserve those gains failed. Basically, the army failed and the political institution crumbled.
Do you think that question should also be answered by the United States, or do you think that should be answered by whom?
When it comes to international relations, I'm pretty much a realist. I think that President Biden is responsible to his constituencies in the United States.
Do you also feel empathetic to also your people?
That's the different issue. It's a moral question of whether what he did was morally right or not. I think he's saying that he doesn't feel any responsibility for what has happened in Afghanistan or what will happen. I think that is a moral failing on his side. But I think in terms of who's going forward, what can be done, that's the question I'm most interested in. I think we've seen Taliban want different things. They often want contradictory things. They generally want international recognition.
Mr. Yang, also about the U.S. role.
Well, I would say the different angle. Simply saying, U.S. wants to be a troubleshooter, but finally become a troublemaker. They want to shoot the trouble by making more troubles. In short period, the terrorism from Afghanistan had been cracked down, but in long run, the roots of the terrorists is getting bigger than before. Also, after 20 years with huge costs, not only from the United States, but also bigger costs from Afghanistan people, actually lead to more worried uncertainties, as I mentioned. The uncertainty of the fate of Afghanistan, the uncertainty of the future governance of Afghanistan, the uncertainty of multi-crises inside Afghanistan, and much of the crisis will flow over the boundary of Afghanistan.
Mr. O'Hanlon, are we going to see a domino effect? Even though we've already seen a domino effect in another logic, for example, war in Afghanistan, war in Iraq, war in Syria, and war in some of the other neighboring countries, the results are very similar.
You're right, and we have to be worried about that. We have to worry about spillover into Pakistan with refugees, maybe into Western China with extremists, into other parts of the region. My overall view is to be quick about it, that we have to really worry about this, but the cost will probably be less than some people think right now. The United States remains very committed to its NATO allies, to Korea and Japan. I don't think anybody's really doubting those commitments because of Afghanistan, which was always seen as a secondary interest. And I think that global terrorism, I worry about it, and I wanted to stay in Afghanistan. I think President Biden was wrong to pull out. But I also think we have other ways of trying to keep an eye on big terrorist sanctuaries that may emerge in Afghanistan. And by the way, China and Russia agree with us that this is not something any of us want to encourage or tolerate. So at this point, China, Russia, and the United States are more unified perhaps than before.
Let me really ask the two Afghans who are with us during this discussion. What does that say? I mean, throughout your history, there was the British Empire, there was the former Russian Tsar, there was the former Soviet Union, and now the United States after 20 years back and forth many times. Afghanistan is a very unique story. What does it say to you as Afghans? Mr. Rahimi and Mr. Mohibi.
I would like to push back against this myth that Afghanistan is a graveyard of empires. Afghanistan actually been many empires have thrived in Afghanistan and actually expanded their powers from Afghanistan. So it hasn't been always a story of failure and invasion. Afghanistan had many empires based there, Orion. I mean, there are a lot of examples, historical examples you would like to pick, especially if you consider the time span that people actually pick from Alexander the Great until now. I mean, there are a lot of empires, cultural hubs, commercial hubs, political powers that emerged in Afghanistan and succeeded. So I would say, I mean, there are success examples, and Afghanistan has not always been the story of failure. But in terms of the foreign invasion and the fate of foreign invasion in Afghanistan, I think we have rarely good examples of foreign invasions in countries that had the conditions the conditions that Afghanistan had when the U.S. invaded Afghanistan. I think I have a hard time seeing good examples of foreign invasion succeeding in those kind of contexts. So it was a very incredibly difficult task to begin with. I think it was mishandled for a variety of reasons. The U.S. was not very much committed from the beginning. Iraq was a larger priority. Resources and manpower was not given early on to create more dividends from intervention and possibly get more support and stop an insurgency from emerging. After the insurgency emerged, it was pretty much a military-heavy strategy of dealing with the insurgency, not understanding the underlying cause, not dealing with the underlying cause, just going military first, force first, but that often end up being counterproductive. So, I mean, I think you can look at it and try to understand why this particular invasion happened. But I think to connect episodes in history, along the history of a country with more than 5,000 years of history, and just the civilization that was there, not necessarily the country, and just conclude that it's just any effort to build the state in Afghanistan is doomed to fail. I think that's not a fair way to look at it.
Mr. Mohibi, so these are sporadic cases, or these are cases that actually share some common ground and therefore make us understand better about history from a certain perspective?
Well, here's the thing. I mean, Afghanistan's location or geography has been always its enemy.
Sure.
Located in the heart of Asia, connecting many various emperors. If you look at Tsars or the Britons or the Russians, and even right now the United States, it has a great location. That's a fact. And it's not only it's a landlocked, but it's a country that always has been between the clashes of emperors. So and that's going to be for the rest of its life in this world. But let's not talk about the history at the moment. Let's talk about that exactly why a lot of these events recently turned into a situation like this. Look, I mean, we're not putting the pressure in the United States that, yes, the policy was not right. We could not fulfill some of our policies. But at this right now, there's a still possibility. There's a chance we can prevent another disaster.
That's all the time we have for today. It's all about Afghanistan. There are new developments tomorrow. If you want to see more of the program, search World Insight. Check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.